Hello fellow creatives, Katie here. In this tutorial I'm going to walk you through how I created my coffee stain papers for artwork. I know there are a lot of tutorials out there for this, but I had trouble finding any that were specific to art papers. My goal here was to create textured and unique papers that I could then use for my inked artwork. I haven't tried using watercolor on the stained paper yet, but I always encourage everyone to experiment in your own ways. I specifically chose an extremely heavy-duty watercolor paper for this because I knew they would be soaked multiple times and I needed a paper that was going to hold up to the beating and not wear down and fray in the process. Please note here that I did not try this with any other paper brands, so I can't comment on how other papers will hold up. If you're not able to afford the Arches brand because it is a little bit more expensive, then I can recommend giving Canson a try. Remember, the heavier the paper, the more likely it will withstand the treatment. I'm using a pan that luckily is large enough to fit 2 pieces of paper in without any overlap. If there is overlap, it could create a line on the paper, so try to avoid that. Also, be careful about bubbles because they can leave little circles on the paper. Unless you like that effect, then that works then. I used a spoon to help prevent the bubbles on the, leaving marks on the paper. And the spoon is also handy in lifting up the corner of the paper because the coffee was hot. There are 2 things that are going to contribute to how dark your papers turn out. One of them is going to be how dark you make the actual coffee, so more coffee grounds will make darker coffee. And another factor is the heat. So you'll watch me pour coffee straight right after it's brewed right onto the paper. That made it really dark really fast, so the hotter the coffee is, the less it has to sit. So you just want to be careful, keep an eye on it. I'm using a spoon to kind of check the corners, lift it up, and it does dry a tiny bit darker than how it appears when it's still wet. So just keep that in mind, and as the coffee cools down, you'll want to give it another few minutes time to soak. So when the coffee was really hot, it was probably in there maybe like 3 minutes, not very long at all. But the cooler the coffee got, I had to leave it in for 6, 7, 8 minutes. So there's not a magical number, just keep an eye on it and check it once in a while. Once you're done soaking the paper, make sure to save some of that coffee for later. This is how you're going to apply all of your actual textures. And be sure to save the coffee grounds as well, because this is part of adding the texture too. I just used this random, you can use a bowl, just something that doesn't get stained very easily, which is why I was very careful in wiping up the counters afterwards. I wanted to avoid using the oven for this, so my papers just lay out overnight, and I do recommend letting them dry at least overnight. If you try to add texture when the paper is still wet, it's not going to be very pronounced and it might not transfer very well. So give it a day to dry. I have wax paper set out, so that's what the papers dry on. There's not a lot of rhyme or reason to the way that I applied the coffee grounds to the paper. The way that I added all of my splatter effects was just a bunched up paper towel that I dipped in my leftover coffee, and I didn't warm this up or anything, it's just cold coffee. So the main trick here is to apply enough liquid to the paper that it leaves edges. So this is a good example of why you want the paper to be dry, because if it's wet, it's not going to make those nice hard edges of the liquid as it dries. It would just feather out and it wouldn't be very pronounced. So yeah, have fun with this. Really soak that paper towel and just throw it on there. Just splat it around. You'll get lots of different effects. Shapes are good. Don't be too worried about overdoing it too much. you'll get a good feel for it once you start. I think some of my more favorite papers resulted when I did a combination of the splatter effect and adding the coffee grounds. The coffee grounds really added a fine texture, while the splatter effect added a lot of color variation. If you would like to use both the splatter and add coffee grounds to it, I recommend doing the splatter first. And you can add the coffee grounds while it's still wet, and you can also wait for that to dry to add the coffee grounds, and it's going to give you different effects both ways, and it's not going to be very easy to describe it. So this is one of those things that you'll have to try and see for yourself, you know, in person, how it actually affects the colors once you apply the coffee grounds versus wet and dry. I will say if your coffee grounds dried out too much, the color's not going to transfer very well, so you can spritz it once it's on the paper, or you can add a little bit of water before you add it to the paper. Either way works. So after the coffee grounds have dried, and you want these to be very dry, so I do recommend waiting overnight or at least a full day before you wipe these off, because once you start rubbing that paper, if it's not dry, you're going to make streaks and you're going to push it around. And it might create an effect that you don't like. I just used a dry paper towel to kind of rub off all of the grains that were stuck there. And you do want to be pretty thorough with this part, because if you leave a lot of grains on there, it's going to be really difficult when you go in with your paintbrush, or if you're using a pen. I did use an ink pen on some of the paper, which I did find was a little bit difficult because the paper is extra textured because of the grounds that you put on there. So be aware of that. Once they're dry, because you know these papers were soaked a lot, so they are very wavy, I'm going to try to flatten them out by spritzing the backside of the papers. And don't worry about color transferring, I mean, because we're coffee staining papers, so if anything, a little bit of coffee will get onto more coffee and it'll be fine. It's just regular water in the spray bottle here, using a fine mist. I'm just using a cutting board to help weigh everything down, and as much weight as I could find in the kitchen. I just stacked it on there, and again, I did this overnight. You're basically going for just enough moisture in the paper to flatten it out, but you don't want to soak them. I will list out all of the materials that I used in this video down below, along with some alternatives and a step-by-step basic process of everything that is described here. And there we go. Lovely. By doing this, I discovered a lot of ways to create really unique textures, and honestly, I think there are a lot of things that I hadn't even tried that I think you can, and I encourage it. You know, don't be afraid to do something that is a little outside the box. Tutorials, I think, are meant to get you started. They're definitely not the only way to do something, and I'd like you to experiment with this. You know, take it, run with it, make awesome papers, and make awesome artwork. So yeah. Alright, thanks for joining me, everyone. I'll see you next time.